Happy to be here at UFM, although the subject I'm going to be speaking to you about is unfortunately a depressing one. Depressing one in an intellectual sense, but also a depressing one for the human toll it conveys. But it's a matter of intellectual history as well, something that we as economic thinkers, writers, researchers in our own right have undoubtedly encountered. And that is the legacy of Karl Marx. Some 73 years ago, Friedrich Hayek wrote a devastating critique of the intellectual affinity for socialism that was emerging from the universities of his time. This was in 1949. What did Hayek point out in The Intellectuals and Socialism? Socialism has nowhere been at first a working class movement, as it claims. It is rather a construction of theorists from certain tendencies of abstract thought, which for a long time only the intellectuals themselves were familiar. And it required long efforts by those intellectuals before the working classes could be persuaded to adopt their program. His words remain true some 73 years later. The intellectuals are still captivated by socialism. And I am here to speak about one such socialist who enjoys immense intellectual favor, and that is Karl Marx. To give you an idea of Marx's impact, consider the fact that only 2 weeks ago we celebrated the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Soviet Union, the demise of one of the most tyrannical regimes in human history. It was not Marx's only toll, but the Soviet Union was one of the major contributors to a body count of over 100 million people in the last century. It was one of the major contributors to the spreading and dissemination of totalitarianism worldwide, to the Iron Curtain that swept across Europe, to colonialist efforts to expand Marxist socialism into the developing world, to the spread of Marxist ideology to regimes such as Maoist China, Pol Pot's Cambodia, Ho Chi Minh's Vietnam, the Kim family's North Korea, Fidel Castro's Cuba, and Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro's Venezuela. We still see the legacies in these countries today. And yet, 30 years after Marx's regime in the Soviet Union fell, we look at his intellectual reputation in the universities and their dissemination into intellectual elite media. And I give you a brief presentation here of some of the major examples that came out on the 200th anniversary of Marx's birth in 2018. The New York Times declared, "Happy birthday, Karl Marx. You were right." The Financial Times, "Why Karl Marx is more relevant than ever." The Economist, "Rulers of the world, read Karl Marx. Why has a totalitarian ideology that everywhere it's attempted has resulted in mass poverty and suffering and death still so celebrated?" No true Marxism is normally the answer that they give us. But if you think that's a dismal picture, let's look at the stats. In 2007, a survey was done of American university faculty. 1/5 of all social sciences declared that they were Marxists outright. That number has only gone up since then. Could you imagine if 1/5 of all social scientists declared that they were fascists or Nazis? Similar regimes that have similar death tolls. In 2013, the science journal Nature did a study of Google Scholar citations. They found that Karl Marx ranked as the preeminent intellectual influence in academic citations. Second was, I think, Sigmund Freud, and it trailed off from there into prominent scientists, philosophers, and mathematicians. But Karl Marx, his influence ranked number one. To show you how much worse it's gotten, in 2020, I did a study of university syllabi, what readings they are assigning. Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto is the single most frequently assigned philosophical tract worldwide in university systems, according to the Open Syllabus Project. Outranked only by a couple grammar manuals in textbooks. The only other philosopher that comes close to Marx is Plato in Plato's Republic. The Communist Manifesto is actually cited and assigned at 2 to 3 times the frequency of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, John Locke's treatises on government, and any other traditional reading in the philosophical canon. And that's only his most popular book, the Communist Manifesto. If you read Das Kapital, it ranks similarly to some of the other works. Marx's influence today is not just confined to Marxist economics, which are actually a fringe group, an extreme heterodoxy in the economics profession, but they have spread into other disciplines where he is now the mainstream. Marxist thought has spawned dozens of Marxist schools in history, philosophy, sociology, literature, art, architecture, or anything with the name studies in it. Marxist-inspired movements now include literary criticism, post-colonial studies, and the ever-present, ubiquitous critical theory. My purpose today is in part to ask why Karl Marx's reputation is so resilient from the disastrous political track record, but it's also to ask another question. Why is Karl Marx even relevant at all? Why does he have an intellectual reputation at all? And to understand that question, we must go all the way back to Karl Marx's lifetime. When Karl Marx died in 1883, he was an obscure figure at the fringes of radical labor activism. None of his books burst into the mainstream in his own lifetime, not even his magnum opus, Das Kapital, which was published in 1867. In fact, Das Kapital was rendered obsolete in the economics profession only 4 years after its publication by the famous events of the Marginal Revolution of 1871. That was when William Stanley Jevons and Karl Menger jointly discovered an alternative theory of value to the one proposed in Marx's book and system. Marx had constructed his entire economic set of beliefs around the labor theory of value, the notion that value derives from the work performed on objects. From that, he concluded that a difference exists between the surplus value of the good, that which is charged by the seller, the capitalist, the bourgeois, and the value of the labor performed. And this difference, you could extract a theory of exploitation. The laborer was denied access to the value of the work performed on a given good. And from this, the entire Marxist system flows. Labor is alienated from the product that it produces. Laborers outnumber the capitalists. Eventually, revolution follows. But Marx's system of value is wrong. Where does value derive? Value is subjective, as Menger and Jevons and later economists discovered. And subjectivity comes from individual preference, known only to the individual and exercised at the margin the moment the decision is made relative to the next economic decision. That single discovery renders the entire Marxist system obsolete. Marx's system, nonetheless, has gained a profound resilience today. Over a century and a half after it's first toyed around in the 19th century and presented by Marx, we see academia continuing to embrace it. And I'll show you some evidence here again. Academia, although it has always leaned to the left of center, in the last 2 decades has shifted to the far left. Left-leaning faculty, by their own self-identification, are now a complete majority in the U.S. economic system and probably most other university systems worldwide, which tend to follow the U.S. model. Most of that growth has occurred on the far left, which used to, only 20 years ago, consist of about 4 to 5% of university faculty. That has tripled in the last 2 decades, and most of it comes from identification with Karl Marx. So I ask, what's the paradox here? Marx was rejected in his own lifetime and obliterated in the decades following his death as an economic thinker, and yet he's revived today. Here's a quick timeline. As I mentioned, Das Kapital was published in 1867 and almost entirely ignored, except among Marxist activists. 1871, as I noted, it was rendered obsolete. Marx died in relative obscurity in 1883. In 1885, the first explicit marginalist critique of Marx's book, The Economist, actually engaged it, by Philip Wicksteed, a follower of William Stanley Jevons, was written. And he noted that the labor theory of value had been rendered obsolete, and so did the remainder of the textbook. It continued from there. The Austrian economist, Eugen von Weizsäcker, wrote a book-length refutation of Marx's Das Kapital in 1897 on marginalist and internal contradiction grounds. But also, most notably for the economics profession, was the 1890 publication of Alfred Marshall's Principles of Economics, the first modern textbook to attain widespread dissemination in economics. And what did Marshall do? He noted that Marx's system was rooted in circularity and shrouded in mysterious Hegelian phrases, but fundamentally self-contradictory and not worthy of consideration. Economics had rejected Marx within 2 decades of his death, even though they had given it serious consideration. Even those who tried to make Marx's system work, despite the rejection of the discipline, eventually came to concede that it had internal inconsistencies. Marx's basic arithmetic for converting the value of labor into prices had a self-contradiction, a mathematical self-contradiction. Marx assumed that input values derived from labor performed on a good, per the labor theory of value, and yet inputs, including the labor, are purchased at market prices. The value derived from labor performed, where do prices come from in the market? Unable to solve these simultaneous components of the equation, in 1907, the mathematician Ladislav Bortkiewicz proposed a contradiction to what was later referred to and has since become known as the transformation problem in Marxist analysis. Bortkiewicz's essay remains basically unpublished from its publication, from its original drafting in 1907, when he hit a mathematical dead end, until its rediscovery by other Marxist economists in 1942. Upon its rediscovery, they realized very quickly the implications for classical Marxism. The math will never add up. They've nonetheless tried to find other workarounds ever since. And yet, while Marx's economics were rejected, most other academic disciplines simply ignored him. I surveyed all the leading journals at the turn of the 20th century in law, philosophy, politics, sociology, education, and of course economics. The only discussions of Marx of any substance are in economics journals generally devoted to rejecting him. Elsewhere, he's basically ignored. Not even cited in law and literature and education journals in any substantive form at all by the turn of the century. In 1909, Harvard University published what became known as Dr. Eliot's 5-foot bookshelf, the Harvard classics, of what were considered to represent the Western canon of intellectual thought at that point in history. The Harvard classics were, exactly as they were described, a 5-foot-long bookshelf of dozens upon dozens of volumes containing original primary source texts. Adam Smith had an entire volume dedicated to him, as did other leading economic thinkers of the 19th century, such as John Stuart Mill. Karl Marx is nowhere to be found in Dr. Eliot's 5-foot shelf. He was too obscure to be considered. Today, in 2022, that pattern is completely reversed. Marx remains rejected by most economists and only considered in his place relevant to the history of economic thought. But in other disciplines, as we have seen, in sociology, philosophy, political theory, and law, Marx is now everywhere. Literature has entire subfields and journals dedicated to Marxist analysis of fictional texts. Education theory has been overwhelmed by the critical pedagogy movement of Paulo Freire, the most commonly assigned textbook in schools of education today worldwide. In the past 120 years, Marx has moved from obscure obsolescence into the intellectual mainstream. The great question before us is why, and I will propose an answer. But first, let's consider some more condemnations of Marx to show how thoroughgoing the economist rejection of him was. In 1907, the Economic Journal, the leading publication of the English Academy in the study of economics, and today one of the leading economic journals in the world, was asked to review Karl Marx's Das Kapital, second volume, in a newly published translation. The reviewer, C. Violet Butler, likened it to Don Quixote charging at a windmill, asking simply in her review, who should tilt at such a windmill? It was so irrelevant. Economists have continued to reject Marx. Even John Maynard Keynes in 1925 describes Marx's Das Kapital as an obsolete textbook without interest or application to the modern world. Ludwig von Mises, shortly afterward, says Marx's Capital is essentially a garbled rehash of David Ricardo. And to show that this is not simply a matter of free market thought, Paul Samuelson, in his 1962 address to the American Economic Association, declares that from the viewpoint of pure economic theory, Karl Marx can be regarded as a minor post-Ricardian. This is in 1962, midway through the century, and at the high watermark of the Soviet Union. Why, though, has Marx resurged in the mainstream? The answer I will propose, how did Marx go mainstream, comes from one historical event. The Russian Revolution of 1917, the seizure of control of one of the world's great powers, the Russian government, by a small band of Marxist adherents and progeny under Vladimir Lenin. There's a poster of him. You may recognize some of the art forms. How did Marx go mainstream? Other philosophers have speculated on this for a long time. Frederick Charles Copleston, in his monumental multi-volume History of Philosophy, even went so far as to speculate that had Lenin not taken over the government of a major power, Marx would still be obscure today. I quote Lauren Lemansky, the philosopher, who comes to the same recognition. In a later essay, wrote that without the Soviets, Marx's visible presence today would probably be roughly the same number of textbook footnotes enjoyed by other defunct 19th century economists of similar stature. For example, Nassau Sr. Raise your hand if you've read the works of Nassau Sr. He was a contemporary of Marx who matched Marx's citations in the 1860s when he wrote. So what is the answer? Why did the Soviet Revolution elevate Marx, and can we demonstrate this? I will propose to you that not only can we demonstrate it, but we can do so empirically, and the empirics are robust. The empirics are overwhelming, that this one event in human history elevated Marx from a fringe figure, indeed a competitor among dozens of other socialists of similar stature, relegated to the fringe of intellectual thought, and into the mainstream, even surpassing within a decade of the revolution the number of citations that well-known figures such as Adam Smith received. To do so, I turn to my own work with the economist Michael Jacobi and an advanced econometric technique called the synthetic control method. Synthetic control uses computer algorithms to test counterfactual events, events that never happened versus the data that we do have. It solves or attempts to understand and empiricize one of the great problems of causality and causal inferences in the social sciences. How do you determine inflection points historically from events that never happened versus what really did happen? What happened in 1917? In other words, can we imagine a hypothetical world in which Lenin fails, in which the Soviet Union never comes into existence, and Marx's reputation, at least according to Coplton and Lemaski, is never elevated into the mainstream. And we argue that yes, we can, using a new tool called the Google Ngram database, which, if you know Google Ngram, is their scanned compendium of millions of volumes of texts in the world's great libraries. Estimates differ, but they are thought to have scanned somewhere between 10 and 20% of all books that exist in libraries going back centuries to permit textual analysis. And textual analysis allows us to determine when certain phrases come into use historically, certain concepts decline historically as a percentage of the overall canon, and as we show, when intellectual figures are cited or decline in reputation. To study Karl Marx's presence in Google Ngram, we assembled 227 other authors from the broader intellectual canon. Philosophers from Plato and Aristotle, to economists such as Adam Smith, to thinkers who cross both disciplines, such as Herbert Spencer and John Stuart Mill. We study John Locke. We study the American founders. We include great works of literature, great works and authors of the scientific languages, such as Charles Darwin, Sigmund Freud. We also include contemporary socialists to Karl Marx, who wrote in his own lifetime, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, Ferdinand Lassalle, Johannes Karl Rodbertus. Popular names I'm sure we have all heard of and studied. They used to be of similar stature to Marx prior to 1917 in their citation patterns. Using 1917 as our empirical test, we asked the basic question: what would have happened to Marx's citations had the Bolshevik Revolution never occurred? And we construct a counterfactual Marx out of other authors who matched his citations prior to 1917. This is done by computer algorithm to remove the possibility of human error and bias in selecting the other authors. Instead, we throw all 227 into the list and let the synthetic control select what the tightest fit is to construct our counterfactual Marx. Our algorithms produced a synthetic counterfactual Marx paired to other socialist writers who matched him in citation patterns prior to 1917. And you can see the weights there. By far the largest are two contemporary socialists, Ferdinand Lassalle and Johannes Karl Rodbertus. Rodbertus being the German socialist, democratic socialist thinker, who his followers in the 19th century were consistently accusing Marx of plagiarizing the theory of surplus value from. In fact, Friedrich Engels spent the latter part of his life defending Marx from the accusation of plagiarism from Rodbertus. And yet Rodbertus is not known today except in deep historical circles that study the history of economic thought. Other weights are drawn from mostly 19th century contemporaries, some socialist and some not, and yet you can see the pattern. What did 1917 do to Marx's citations? I will show you. Quite simply, 1917, which you can see there in the dotted line, separates the actual Marx, which is the black line, from the synthetic Marx that we constructed from matched citations prior to 1917 and the computer algorithm that selected them. And as you can see, the break is immediate and sharp. This only traces through 1932, where we can safely assume and isolate that these are direct effects of the Bolshevik Revolution. But to give you an idea, that's what happens if we continue the pattern across the entire 20th century. Red line is pre-1917 Marx as a synthetic counterfactual constructed from the citation patterns of other authors that matched him before the Bolshevik Revolution. The blue line is the actual citation pattern of Marx, the one that overtook Adam Smith and every other writer in the Western canon that we considered over the 20th century. So we have conclusive evidence in statistics that the Bolshevik Revolution is what elevated Marx into the intellectual mainstream. We also tested for robustness using a variety of different techniques. I won't go into every one, but I will show you one of the more interesting, which is if we limit our discussion to German language books only. Marx wrote primarily in German, not exclusively, but primarily in German. So the question is raised, maybe Marx spread from the German language world into other countries. Not so. It turns out the same pattern is true. He matches obscure socialists prior to 1917, shoots off in reputation, is briefly suppressed because of World War II and Nazi efforts to actually obscure and hide Marxist texts. But after East Germany falls to the Soviet Union after World War II, what we see is the same pattern resuming. Marx takes off in reputation in German language texts. Similar observations can be found if we restrict our analysis only to socialists. We restrict it to non-socialists. We find that this one event, the Russian Revolution of 1917, explains the surge in Marx's reputation. How so? After Lenin's band of ruffians seized control of a major world power's government, initially, newspapers and magazines and intellectuals around the world tried to familiarize themselves with this once obscure theorist that was only known in socialist circles and only as a competitor among many socialist traditions. As they were drawn to understanding the obscure philosophy that had a near cult following of the Leninist Bolsheviks, Lenin set the full energy of the Russian government he had taken over into disseminating and propagandizing Karl Marx's work. That included, what we see an example here, the Marx-Engels translations and publication of the collected works of both of these authors into every language that they could possibly afford. These are only 4 volumes of the Mega 1 series, which was directly funded by the Soviet state in the 1920s. It's extended to dozens upon dozens of volumes and basically a publication of every scrap of paper, letter, note, and major work that Karl Marx ever produced. These were promoted by Progress Publishers, an official publishing house of the state government of the Soviet Union that spread it to universities worldwide. Lenin also mandated the teaching of Marxist doctrine in universities in the Soviet Union, and as the Soviet Union's sphere of influence grew, so did Marxist teaching. Lenin built a personality cult around Marx with statues, some of which are very familiar to us. Others toppled in 1991 after the fall of the Soviet Union. He built a cult of personality of pilgrimages to Karl Marx's grave in London, dating all the way back to 1903, when he declared personally that Marx was the forerunner of the true socialist movement, the one that he was building himself. And he also strived to associate himself and his followers and his heirs in the Bolshevik movement via propaganda posters with Marx's legacy, proclaiming the Soviet Union as a true Marxist state. Propaganda spread across the 20th century. And though we cannot directly causally infer each subsequent movement in the mainstreaming of Marx from 1917, we know that they stand on 1917's shoulders. The familiar pattern has ensued. That pattern is that socialism takes over a government. As it takes over a government, the intellectuals rally to socialism and proclaim that new government as the true socialist state. That state then descends into chaos, poverty, famine, and genocide. It enacts itself with violence and sustains itself with violence, but ultimately collapses. And then we achieve the familiar refrain, but that was not true socialism, and the cycle starts again. That cycle has started again, as we have seen even in the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union. New regimes claim to be the true heirs of Marx, built upon that propagandizing of Lenin. What does this lead us to in conclusions? Although I cannot say with certainty that Marx would have forever remained an obscure figure, I cannot say with certainty that other revolutions would not have followed. from 1917, I can say that 1917's events, and peculiar events, were what brought Marx's works, not on their own merits, but on their political fallout, to the attention of the world. And as it achieved that attention, it spread. By implication, the Russian Revolution empirically caused Marx to be cited in the next decade at approximately 3 times the rate he otherwise would have been had he followed the trajectory that he was on. And it only accelerated from there. So the intellectuals adopted Marx in the wake of the political adoption of Marx. Even non-Soviet versions of Marxism follow from, they do not predate, they follow from the events of the Soviet Union. So for instance, the Western Marxist emergence of the Frankfurt School in 1920s and 1930s Germany, which jumps into the United States and spreads across the New World's intellectual and university scene in the subsequent decades. Otherwise, we could imagine perhaps a world in which Marx today might only be as famous as Johannes Karl Rodbertus, Mikhail Bakunin, Ferdinand Lassalle, and other relatively obscure socialist thinkers who were competitors in his own day. The interesting counterfactual being that most of the socialist competitors, even though they subscribed to socialist economic doctrine, espoused a peaceful acquisition of power, not a revolutionary one, not one that embraced and turned to violence as its inherent movement. And yet Marx squeezed those other thinkers out of the socialist tradition and now has turned to squeezing non-socialist thinkers out of the intellectual canon. Where does this leave us today? In an intellectual conundrum, but it's a conundrum that we must also recognize rests on a very ugly and dubious legacy. And that legacy is that the USSR, the Bolshevik regime of the Soviet Union that violently overthrew a government and then proceeded to slaughter tens of millions of its own citizens through famine, genocide, and internment camps, is what politically gave Marx his mainstream stature today, not the merits of his ideas, but the conquest at the point of the sword. And with that, I thank you, and I will leave you to questions.